Hi, everyone. Welcome to the series on the political economy of health in Europe. I'm your host, Carlos Muntaner from the University of Toronto. This series came about when having a conversation with my colleague and friend, Rick Wolf from NYU. He suggested it would be a great idea that we interviewed political economists about the situation in Europe and the prospects for its future, meaning after the COVID pandemic. And with Rosina Somani, also at the University of Toronto, we began to schedule interviews with some of the available and most interesting political economists that we found. A problem that we had and that we are working on it is that so far we were not able to interview women, economists, sociologists, or political scientists. But we hope that in the future we have some of them. I wanted to share with you that the analyses are overwhelmingly made by scientists, university professionals, with one exception, which is the sociologist that doubles as a politician, Carles Riera from the CUP party in Catalonia. His perspective, I think, is very fresh and kind of unique, based also on his unique insights into the political process. So without further ado, I leave you with these interviews. Please click the like if you do so, and send us your comments. So see you on the web, hopefully. Bye now. I am Carlos Muntaner, to introduce myself, and Rosina is working with me at the University of Toronto. You know our background. And that we're working with Democracy at Work with Dr. Wolf, who's leading the effort. And for the Marxian audience, you don't need any introduction, but if you want to briefly introduce yourself, it would be your books are a reference for Marxism, the branch that I could call Trotskyist. If I'm wrong, correct me, please. And your history books too have been of a great impact during the last 10 years. And please add anything you would like before I make you a couple of questions.
Well, what you've said is very kind. Yeah, I mean, I work mainly in Marxist theory, both, what shall I say, pure and applied. So I study the development of Marxist thought, particularly Marxist capital, its central work, the central work of the tradition, but I also see how we can use it to understand concrete situations. I've written a lot about the struggle against apartheid and colonialism in Southern Africa, for example, but the minute I'm just trying to make sense of the bizarre state that the world has got into. Professionally, I'm an academic. I've just retired as Professor of European Studies at King's College London. I was born and brought up in Zimbabwe, so I have a complicated background.
Very interesting. I didn't know the later. All you said is perfect to answer the question we would like you to answer during this interview, or the two questions, which are how do you see, what are the, using your Marxian background, how can you analyze the current political economic problems that today are facing Europe, the European countries, in a way that you may want to define, either through the EU 15 or the 28 or another conceptualization that you may prefer, and what are the solutions that you would envision to these problems during the COVID and post-COVID, if we can talk about that era that we began.
Okay. Let me just say, make a point about Europe. I understand Europe as something broader than the European Union. You mentioned the Europe of the 28, but it's actually the Europe of the 27 now, and I'm a citizen of the United Kingdom, which has left the European Union, but definitely is still part of Europe. And I would say Europe extends deep into the Eurasian landmass and extends in particular into Russia and its periphery. So I have a broad understanding of Europe, which I think is important to avoiding the kind of Eurocentric approach, which is very common, particularly in the EU. That's point number one. Point number two, I would say to a significant extent, Europe is like the rest of the world in that it's grappling with a three-dimensional crisis. The first dimension of the crisis is the economic depression that Europe, like the rest of the world, is experiencing. Now this depression, and it is a depression, it's the kind of falls in output and to a lesser extent rises in unemployment that we're seeing are comparable to those of the 1930s. This depression was precipitated by the pandemic and by the need to implement lockdowns and so on. But it represents a much longer period of crisis with which the capitalist system, particularly in the so-called center of the system, i.e. Europe and North America, has been grappling. The way I put it is that in particular, Europe and North America never overcame the global financial crisis at the end of the last decade. And the main means that have been used to sustain economic growth since then, very low interest rates, so-called quantitative easing, which means central banks printing money or electronically creating money and putting it into the banking system, have reinforced the reliance on credit that was one of the factors behind the explosion of the global financial crisis. Today, it's more companies than banks that, what shall we say, at the center of this debt crisis because of the way in which firms have accumulated cheap debt. So I would say the current economic crisis was a crisis that was waiting to happen, but that was precipitated in a particularly strong form by the pandemic, and the main managers of the global economy, which are the leading central banks, in order to cope with it, have resorted to yet more of the same measures that failed to overcome the global financial crisis, cheap credit, quantitative easing, etc., etc. So that's one dimension of the crisis, and it's extremely serious. If we look at the figures for example, Britain and the United States, we see tremendous pressure on people's incomes and a trend of rising unemployment, which will probably get significantly worse as the kind of special measures to support employment are dismantled. So that's one dimension of this crisis. Europe, in the broad sense in which I use it, is part of this crisis, but in a certain sense, it's not at the center of it. That's one dimension. The second dimension is the pandemic, and not simply the pandemic in itself. In other words, the fact that it's become very clear as we move into fall, that the pandemic has not been overcome. We're seeing in many countries, actually notably in parts of Europe like Britain, the Spanish state, and France, sharp rises in infections caused by the precipitate relaxations of the lockdowns. Carlos, you sound Spanish, and what's happened in Madrid seems to me almost as insane as what the British government does in a routine way, in which in the haste to relax.
I'm Catalan, and
Catalan. Okay.
what I've seen in Barcelona, well, I follow Madrid, is almost just as bad in Catalonia, unfortunately.
Yeah, I apologize for not recognizing that your name is Catalan.
No.
Should have looked more carefully.
Not not at all. I'm no problem at all. Thank you.
But to continue, unless did you want to ask something?
Oh no, I found that very accurate what you mentioned about Madrid, and I just wanted to mention that in Spain and Catalonia, we never overcame the fascist state. We have what they call the 78 regime, which many structures, including government, have still in that fascist way of behaving. Like, for example, when you're a civil servant, you're not your job is not to care for the population necessarily. You have a power slot and you try to expand it, and it's yours. That's the attitude, and nobody can criticize you, for example. That's an aside. So
but I think it's a good point, and I think we were reminded of that with the way in which the central government sought to suppress the independence movement in Catalonia. But what I was saying was that the pandemic is clearly not in any sense overcome, and I don't think it will be in a profound way until vaccines are introduced on a mass scale. So I think that we're caught in a cycle of infection, lockdown, and so on that will continue for some time. But this in itself is a very profound civilizational crisis, the way in which we're trying to learn new ways to live and to survive in the face of this pandemic. But it's also that it's a symptom of something much more profound. The reason why we have this pandemic, as various Marxist writers like Rob Wallace and Mike Davis have shown, is to do with the capitalist penetration of nature, its invasion of the wild spaces of the world, its commercialization and industrialization of farming. which means, although it's a terrible thing to say, that we can probably expect more pandemics like this one, and possibly worse ones. So this is something very profound that I think we're only beginning to come to terms with. So there's this civilizational crisis as well. The third dimension is a political crisis. And here I'll talk more directly about Europe, because the global financial crisis was a crisis of neoliberalism. Although I think it reflected deep underlying problems of profitability that the advanced capitalist economies suffered in the 60s and 70s, and which neoliberalism was never able to solve. The global financial crisis was a consequence of the ways in which neoliberalism sought to overcome the crisis, in particular by making the development, we can argue about how much this was by design or by accident or whatever, but effectively the engine of economic growth became the development of financial bubbles that were tolerated and sometimes encouraged by governments and central banks, and which acted as stimuli to effective demand and therefore to employment. So this was a crisis forged by neoliberalism. Yet the response, and this is clearer in Europe than anywhere else, clearer in the European Union, in the Eurozone, the response to the crisis was more neoliberalism. If you like, neoliberalism recharged in the form of austerity that was imposed, among other places, in the Spanish state, but also in Ireland, and in Greece, and in Portugal. A policy that very few serious economists would defend, but which nevertheless involved, if we look at the kind of institutional changes that have taken place in the EU, in the installation of a regime of permanent austerity policed by unelected bodies, namely the European Commission and the European Court of Justice. And this is the sharpest form of what we see more generally in how the economic, political, and cultural elites reacted to the global financial crisis, that they were able to prevent the crisis leading to the development of successful movements trying to construct some sort of alternative to neoliberalism, and instead were able to perpetuate, and most clearly in Europe, to strengthen the neoliberal economic policy regime. And they thought they had got away with it. But the problem is that the effect of the perpetuation of austerity was to cause great suffering for large sectors of the population, and to deepening existing alienation with the current economic order. And this is the origin of what European elites like to call populism, the kind of backlash, particularly electorally, that we see most sharply expressed in the United States, but which is always also visible in different parts of Europe. If we think of the rise of the AfD in Germany, the sharp move to the right of the British Conservative Party, or the advance of the Liga and its more extreme allies in Italy. Now, this process hasn't gone as far as it has in the United States, where essentially far-right politics in the shape of Donald Trump, and I think it's clear beyond any doubt now that Trump isn't just a clown, but is a serious political actor with a project of his own, and with an agenda that is strengthening the extreme right in the United States to a frightening extent. Trump's victory represented the sharpest expression of this process. Hasn't gone as far in the European Union, partly because the European Union as a cartel of states, a confederation, rather than a unified state, can contain, what shall I say, experiences political changes in quite a fragmented and decentralized way. But it also, it has to be said, it's because the European Union is significantly less democratic than the United States. I mean, that's not a compliment, because the United States, as we see with its electoral college and Senate and so on, isn't a very democratic state. But the EU is significantly less democratic. Its leaders are quite consistent in saying that elections in one or other member state don't count as far as they're concerned. They won't force them to change their policies and so on and so forth. So the EU has been able to hold the forces of reaction in more than one sense at bay, but it too is under pressure from those forces. I'll stop there, I think.
Well, thank you very much. And the second question as to how do you think we could get out of this situation towards the aspiration of the socialist, Marxian, left, anti-capitalist movements that are still alive in many of these countries, even if they were a minority?
Yeah. Yeah, well, that's a very big question. And I think we have to be honest and say that the right has been more successful in exploiting the crisis than the left has been. This multidimensional crisis that I was talking about.
Yes.
Understanding the right broadly as opportunist elements in the established centre-right parties. Boris Johnson is a very good example of that, who are prepared to get on a more far-right bandwagon in order to win and retain power, but also more openly far-right forces, such as Salvini in Italy or the AfD in Germany, which include an openly fascist fringe that is increasingly strong. We have to be honest and say that these forces, on the whole, have been more successful than the left.
So do you know any strategies that you think would be either drawing from history or the current movement and Marxian thought or scholarship or others that could give the left a more revolutionary potential, for lack of a better word, either using the movements, social movements, or the democratic institutions that still exist, or most likely a combination of both?
Well, I can point to some elements. I mean, well, it doesn't pretend, what I'm going to say doesn't pretend to offer a strategy, but I think there are several elements that are important. One is intransigent opposition to neoliberalism. In other words, a refusal to compromise with the pressures for austerity and further privatization and so on and so forth. If we talk about the left in Europe, one of the great tragedies of the last decade is the way in which Syriza, a party of the radical left, carried to government in Greece in 2015 on the back of a huge rejection of austerity, ended up capitulating to the engineers of austerity in Europe.
Yeah, it's like
So
Syriza, yes.
So Syriza is a very important negative counterexample that we have to avoid. So intransigent opposition to neoliberalism is extremely important. I think there's a second element that is extremely important. That is opposition to racism and fascism and solidarity with migrants. I mean, we all know of the appalling tragedy inflicted on migrants by the European Union. I mean, and here I include Britain as, even though it's not part of the European Union, as essentially complicit in this. The way in which the Mediterranean has become a grave for so many desperate people trying to cross the Mediterranean to Europe. And the far right have been able to exploit the so-called migrant crisis in order to build support for them. I think the left has to look at ways of building a counter-movement around very firm opposition to racism and solidarity with migrants. That means that the left has to reflect the kind of societies in which we live. These are societies that are becoming increasingly diverse and reflecting the historic effect of waves of migration and the associated recomposition of the working class. But very often the left doesn't reflect that at all. I mean, this is particularly serious in France, where the Republican ideology has meant that large sections of the left are completely uncomprehending about the condition and aspirations of the large number of Muslim working people who are part of their society. So that's a second element that I think is very important. Now, you can say that both those elements are just affirmations of principle, and that's true, but sometimes it's important to start from strong affirmations of principle if we're thinking about the history of Marxism. Think of people like Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin, who opposed the First World War in conditions of great isolation and subject to repression. Luxemburg, for example, was thrown in prison. I think there's a third element, though, which is that one of the things that the pandemic shows is very starkly that the priorities of our rulers are very different from the priorities of everyone else, because all the relaxations of lockdowns and resistance to the necessary measures to protect the population from the pandemic are motivated by essentially economic considerations. In other words, considerations of trying to maintain the functioning and profitability of contemporary capitalist economies. So that we've had this very stark counterposition of life against profits. And we see the tragic toll that this takes. For example, I mean, in London, the city I live in, bus drivers have died on quite a large scale during the worst phase of the pandemic. Now, if you get on a bus in London, the bus driver is almost certainly going to be black or Asian.
Yes.
And we see also in the figures for the pandemic that certainly in Britain and the United States, black people, because of poverty and the kind of conditions in which they live, large families sometimes living close together and so on, are much more liable to die of COVID-19 than white people. So we have this, it's the politicians and so on like to say we're all in it together, but this is not true at all. I mean, they're protected, although some of them are stupid and still catch it. And we can think of one good example of this at the minute, but the rich are protected in all sorts of ways. I read an article in the Financial Times that yachts, big yachts, are in increased demand now because the rich see these as places where they can sail around, safe, separated from the rest of the population, and they're big enough to have offices and, with the internet to carry on their business and so on and so forth. So the rich are insulated from the pandemic, and it's the mass of the population who are suffering. This is a pandemic that is coded to hit working people, Black people, women, other oppressed groups more harshly than others. And I think that a left that, with the kind of courage needed to take the principal position I was talking about earlier, has a lot to say to people today. This is too horrible a situation, too tragic a situation to describe as an opportunity, but nevertheless, this is a moment when the priorities of the system under which we live have become very starkly clear.
So thank you so much. This has been very enlightening and morally principled, your answer, and I thank you so much for having taken this time to answer these questions.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. And will you send me a link when it goes online or whatever?
Absolutely, no doubt about it.
Yeah,
and I hope we can continue at another time.
Yeah, sure, that'd be great. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Look after yourselves. Have a good day.
Same for you.
We'll try.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye then.